So I want to bring in international relations expert Professor Malte Brosig here. He joins us via Zoom this afternoon to discuss this further. Prof, a very good afternoon to you. You've been on the line for a bit now, and you probably did hear some of the pronouncements that were made by President Cyril Ramaphosa when it comes to South Africa taking its trade relations very seriously with the United States, and that they would not want to jeopardize what has become an integral part of South Africa's economy. But if you juxtapose it to when he mentioned that he had a call with Vladimir Putin and got this amazing round of applause, you wonder where exactly does South Africa stand when it comes to relationships with key international partners?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I think what's really at the center of the last few days is that the US, as well as South Africa, have a fundamentally different understanding of the term non-alignment. For Americans, South Africa is siding too closely with Russia. So their understanding of non-alignment was certainly based on rather cooling off relations with Russia, not necessarily joining international sanctions, but more cool relationships. While on the South African side, the understanding from the presidency as well as DIRCO is that you should have equally good and cordial relationships with the two countries, the US and Russia. And as I think we have seen in the last 24 hours, then that is increasingly more difficult, and quite a lot is at stake. However, if you go through the statements, I mean, we can of course just pick out the more problematic parts, but I mean, we can also see that both countries have kind of downscaled also some of the rhetoric and mentioned a couple of times how important their mutual relationships actually are.
And how interesting is it, Prof, that the US then, after the meeting with our international relations minister, goes on to apologize on social media about the pronouncements that were made? Many sitting wondering, was he apologizing for the way in which he made the announcement, or was he apologizing for the allegation that South Africa actually did supply Russia with weapons? It's a very big gray area at the moment, and we can't really see through all these little details that have been coming over the last few days.
That is true. I mean, there are still lots of open questions, so we don't know what was on that ship actually. So this is speculation from the outside. Of course, I can also not see into this very much, and the same on the media side. So we have to speculate here a little bit, which is something that I really don't wanna do.
Let's talk about South Africa's relations with Russia before we delve into those of the United States. We've got the BRICS relationship, we've got a historical relationship, which one would assume the ANC is holding on to. In the grand scheme of things, how important is South Africa's relationship with Russia? And I ask this in relation to the fact that you're seeing this rise in alternative powers that are not part of the West, China, Russia, trying to separate themselves over the last few years. And I wonder, is South Africa trying to be part of that narrative? And that's why they would seem to be aligned to Russia. And then, of course, the question begs, how important will Russia's relationship with South Africa be as we move into these different times?
I mean, there are certainly different criteria one can apply when it comes to, if you like, measuring importance here. So if we would start just with the economic part, then Russian-South African relations are not that far developed, right? So Russia is not a big export market for South African products, as well as there's not that much of essential technology coming from Russia. However, it looks different on the political side, and you already mentioned the historical relationships during the apartheid and the support of the Soviet Union to the ANC. So there's a bit of history that's there. And of course, then if we make a big jump into the 21st century, There is, I think, a very clear emphasis in South African foreign policy on, creating better relations with non-Western countries as a kind of counterbalance towards the Western economy. And then, of course, when it comes to non-Western countries, Russia does play a very big and important part here. However, if we see then Russia's own behavior as acting like a hegemon in neo-imperial ways, I mean, this basically then also contradicts quite a lot of what the ANC was is fighting for in terms of a decolonial world here.
And then let's juxtapose that with the relationship with the United States. You do say, and I did say this in my intro, that the economic relations between South Africa and the United States are absolutely important. But when you juxtapose it to what you've just described, the relationship between Russia and South Africa and that of the United States, that role that it plays with South Africa as well.
Yeah, I mean, the relations with the US are also multifaceted on many ways. But in the introduction, of course, you pointed out the importance of AGOA and the trade agreement. And this is something where South Africa, I think, profits mostly from good relations with the US. And on the other hand, then the US doesn't really need that trade agreement for its own economy. So it's just a tiny fraction of the US economy, but it's of high relevance for South Africa. So there's a bit of an certainly imbalance in here. But what we could also see with the Biden administration, I mean, it was really trying to create better relationships and reconnecting also with the African continent. If that actually works out with how the American ambassador, was acting in the last 24 hours, that's an other question. And I think that was not so a good example here.
Yeah. Prof, this is probably going to be a little bit of a tough one, because many watching the president a few moments ago would be wondering, how does South Africa move forward in the current state of affairs, sitting on the fence, if you will, saying that they're non-aligned with any thing that's happening in the world and would prefer resolutions in the form of peaceful negotiation? How do you please both sides going forward as South Africa, and really just expect those sides to play ball? At some point, you're going to have to pick a side, which one would assume both Russia and the United States are able to twist South Africa's arm in some way. How does the country navigate that?
Yeah, very important questions, and I think we have to talk about this much more in public debates here on television and in other places. I mean, it's totally understandable that those, let's say, smaller countries at global standards don't want to get sucked into conflicts in which they are actually not a part. Not playing a part, and so there is, some value in that non-alignment position. But the question then really is, what is non-alignment, and where does it start, and where does it end? And I think that is, having joint military exercises with Russia, or the defense minister traveling to Moscow, etc., and other things, then makes it problematic to argue that, okay, you're non-aligned, but at the same time, there is no change in the relationship to Russia, despite the war going on against Ukraine. So that really is not convincing here. And then, of course, however, I don't believe that we are going back in terms of there will be a second Cold War here. I think the world has changed dramatically in terms of multipolarity, so there are a number of larger players, and I don't really think it's fair to countries that they would need to choose one side over the other. So that's a tremendous balancing act, and these terms of non-alignment and neutrality, I think we have to unpack them. We have to critically discuss them to really come to the ground what it means. And obviously there are lots of contradictions, and that one can stumble over here.
Thank you very much for those insights, Professor. And thank you for being patient with us while we listened to the President break down various issues, including the one you and I have just spoken about. That is international relations expert Malte Brosig from the University of Witwatersrand joining us this afternoon to break down the big story over the last week around the relations with the United States and South Africa, and also South Africa and Russia. A tough balancing act, as the Professor has mentioned.